Resuming debate, and by video conference, the Honourable Member for Beaches, East York.
We increasingly live our lives online, and our laws need to reflect that reality. Privacy is a human right, and it is inextricably connected to our personal autonomy. Council of Europe's Convention 108 says this: the purpose of this convention is to protect every individual, whatever his or her nationality or residence, with regard to the processing of their personal data, thereby contributing to respect for his or her human rights and fundamental freedoms, and in particular, the right to privacy. The GDPR says this regulation protects fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons, and in particular, their right to the protection of personal data. The incredible scale of data collection can be a powerful force, both for good and for bad. So we need strong privacy and digital rights and a strong regulator to enforce them. Now, there is much in our government's Bill C-11, a serious reform of PIPEDA, and certainly long overdue. I remember, Mr. Speaker, in June of 2018, I'd introduced legislation simply to give the Privacy Commissioner new powers, which our Privacy Committee had twice unanimously recommended. And we have come a long way since then with this substantive bill. Open Media says of Bill C-11, it is a big win for privacy in Canada. And while I've heard some reflections from experts and certainly from some parliamentary colleagues already about how the bill can potentially be improved, or some open questions about what might need to be fixed, it is certainly deserving of our support at second reading. And I look forward to working with colleagues across party lines to improve the legislation at committee where we can. And now at this point, as I mentioned, working at committee across party lines, something of a detour is required. And I want to specifically commend colleagues from the Conservative Party, Prince George and Thornhill, a colleague from the NDP in Timmins, James Bay, and my Liberal colleague from Kitchener Centre. We worked very long and hard on privacy issues in the last Parliament, and we helped found the International Grand Committee, comprised of over 10 countries, to discuss these issues. We hosted actually the second meeting of the IGC in Ottawa, and we tabled a report in February of 2018 towards Privacy by Design that, when we talk as parliamentarians about committee work, and often the overlooked nature of the committee work, we don't always see that committee work turn into legislation. Well, in this instance, we have, where we recommended stronger consent rules, and we see stronger rules in Bill C-11. We recommended algorithmic transparency, and we see in C-11 a commitment on transparency where systems are used to make predictions, recommendations, or decisions about consumers. We recommended data portability and interoperability, and we see those commitments in Bill C-11. We see stronger powers for the Privacy Commissioner. I mentioned that need for a strong regulator, including order making, auditing, and the ability to levy fines. And we see order making powers, we see the ability to audit, and we see through a new tribunal, which I understand some of the caution or questions that members are raising in respect of this design, but is consistent with the competition commissioner and tribunal operation, and is worth looking at more seriously to see if it can be improved. But we see the ability to levy significant fines on the magnitude of $10 to $25 million, $25 million maximum for more serious fines. Now, in the course of that committee work, and I want to reflect on a couple of stories about why this kind of legislation is so important and critical. First, it was in the fall, I think, of 2017, but we were in the midst of the study on PIPEDA reform, and the member from Thornhill, and at the time it was the member for Skeena Valley, and I think I'm getting that right. And I went down to Washington, and we met with other elected representatives there. We witnessed some of the hearings in relation to the Equifax breach, but we also met with Facebook officials. And at that time, when it was put, I think, by the member of Thornhill, that what is their view on potential new regulations? And at the time they said, well, no new regulations are required. Absolutely no new regulations are required in Canada. We have a strong framework through PIPEDA. And in fact, if there were new rules, well, that might affect our willingness and interest in investing in Canada. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, we have come a long way since those kinds of conversations and the pushback by big tech companies against stronger privacy rules, where we now see Mark Zuckerberg unfortunately not attend before the IGC, and though he says he would like to work with parliamentarians around the world, but certainly say that the days of self-regulation are over and asking for regulation. Well, here is that kind of regulation in Canada. Now, on consent, I have to tell one other story, Mr. Speaker, out of committee, where, again, we had Facebook officials. We were in the midst of going down the rabbit hole of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And in the course of the Canadian context, that third-party app that had shared so much information, I think it was under 300 Canadians that had used the app, but thousands of Canadians had their information shared, and it was put to Facebook at the time. I said to them, how is it that on the basis of meaningful consent, thousands of Canadians could have agreed that their friends share their information to this third-party app and then shared on to Cambridge Analytica? And with a straight face, somehow, Facebook representatives said to me, well, it's in our terms and conditions. And this speaks to the problematic nature of consent in the existing law and the lack of meaningful consent. And thankfully, our privacy commissioner, despite the lack of meaningful powers that he currently has pursued that line of inquiry, has found that Facebook violated our current laws and has taken that matter to court. But we know that with stronger consent rules, that there would have been no ability for Facebook to say with a straight face that there was meaningful consent. And so plain language is important. I would go further, though, and say, as we think about consent, particularly in a consumer context, I think we ought to be more wary of privacy by default. We have to be more concerned about privacy by default. And we have to think through where there is a reasonable expectation of the consumer that our information is going to be shared and used in a particular way, then explicit consent obviously ought not need to be required. But where there are secondary uses, where there are uses beyond the reasonable expectation of that consumer, then certainly we need explicit opt-in consent, and it needs to be very clear to consumers that how their information is to be used, if at all. And I want to emphasize the consumer context because it is a curiosity of privacy legislation and a curiosity of consumer protection legislation that when I purchase my phone, I don't have to read the terms and conditions. There is no expectation by government that I read the terms and conditions, and yet I am protected. There are implied warranties pursuant to consumer protection legislation. I don't need to read those terms and conditions in order for my rights to be protected as a consumer. And yet there is an expectation that when I download the app on my phone, when I download any app on my phone, that I read the terms and conditions. And that can't be a tenable state of affairs, that if we want to protect consumers, we can't expect consumers to read every term and condition, to read every consumer contract in the course of downloading applications, in the course of living their lives, as I say, increasingly online. And as I say, our laws do need to reflect that reality. Now, in terms of fixes to this legislation, and with the remaining time that I have, there are obviously some straightforward fixes. The membership of the tribunal should obviously have greater privacy expertise. I think that's a no-brainer. I think we do have to think more deeply through some of these consent rules and how we can strengthen them potentially further. I would like to see us go further potentially on beyond algorithmic explainability to some kind of algorithmic accountability. I know that others have mentioned political parties being left out. I don't know that political parties need to be subject to PIPEDA specifically, but they ought to be subject to privacy legislation. And if there is not a further effort underway by the government, then I think PIPEDA may well be the place to do that. And lastly, I think we have to focus too on children in particular. And when we look at those consent rules and protecting kids on the internet, I've previously written publicly and spoken publicly about my support for a right to be forgotten, but I do think we have to be more focused on our rules and protection as kids grow up with the internet and live their entire lives online. And I'll close, Mr. Speaker, by simply saying this is a big bill. This is second reading, and certainly all of us ought to support this in principle. And I look forward to working with experts and working with colleagues to strengthen this bill at committee and to getting into the details. Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague's speech on this. Now, one of the concerns that's been highlighted by a number of other colleagues in this place is the fact that this bill may have the unintended consequence of creating an unlevel playing field for small and medium-sized enterprises versus the big players that have teams of lawyers and departments that can deal with this sort of thing versus the small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to have to grapple with the consequences of this sort of legislation. I'm wondering if the member would be able to provide some context about any safeguards that may exist or any suggestions that he would have to ensure that there is in fact a level playing field in that regard. Thank you.
The honourable member for Beaches East York.
I would say a few things. One, the concept of proportionality is really important in this regard. Two, it's a live concern that should be addressed by the committee in some respect, but I would also note, and I would present some caution in response to say there are some small companies that collect mountains of personal information, and it's not necessarily the size of the company, but it is the activities of the company that we ought to be most concerned about.
Questions and comments? And by video conference, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for an excellent speech. I felt I should have written it with him at some points because we spent so much time together studying this and pushing government for action. So there are some key elements in this legislation that certainly comes from our work together on the Ethics Committee. I'm interested in the issue of algorithmic accountability because I think that's something that the Ethics Committee was way out in front on. And when I look at the legislation, the other legislation about having Facebook and Google under CRTC, I feel like it's like the best idea for the 1990s when we're dealing with algorithmic powers that are pushing extremist content, that are pushing, Holocaust denial, and we've seen how that is the real driver on the big social media platforms and the inability of parliamentarians to actually look inside that black box. I'd ask my honourable colleague about how he would suggest that we actually get some stronger accountability mechanisms on the algorithms that are pushing the content and driving people to certain sites and to certain conversations.
I thank the member for his question. I thank the member for his question, and I'm looking forward to getting back to the Ethics Committee to work with the member from Timmins James Bay on these issues. When we look at the use of algorithms and the use of algorithms combined with just the scale of data collection that we see today, we can narrowly focus in on consumer privacy on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are bigger conversations about how that information is used to target messages to us, the implications for our democracy. There's a reason that when we hosted that meeting in Ottawa through the IGC, that it was big data, privacy, and democracy. And in terms of algorithmic accountability specifically, I would say I am not certain yet what the perfect solution looks like, but I have always been interested in the work of the Treasury Board, actually, in respect of algorithmic impact assessments. And I think it's clear enough, and I'm glad to see in C-11 that there is a commitment to algorithmic transparency. But going further and having some body, potentially the Privacy Commissioner, being able to look under the hood and audit algorithms and the potential positive and negative impacts, I think is important, and we need to figure out a way of doing just that.
Questions and comments? Time for one more short question and response. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to acknowledge just the phenomenal amount of work that the Standing Committee did do in order to help facilitate the recommendations. And if the member could just provide some of his thoughts in regards to a lot of the pre-presentation of the legislation that was involved, if he has any closing thoughts on that.
The Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thanks to the member for the question. I would just say very quickly that this is one of the few examples I have seen in this Parliament at this scale at least, where parliamentarians of all parties worked constructively, worked really collegially. You would not be able to tell which member of which party we were, asking questions of Facebook officials, of Google, of various representatives, of other experts. And when we made those recommendations in February 2018, I don't think that people were particularly seized with this issue. And then we went down the rabbit hole of Cambridge Analytica and really continued the examination of these issues and this work. And out of that work, I can see our committee work reflected in this legislation. And I think members of all parties ought to be proud of that. And we ought to now take that and work even more to improve this legislation going forward.